Welcome to the Meet the Wrigley Faculty webinar series. I'm Katie Shabostel, Development Officer for the Friends of the Wrigley Institute. I hope you and your loved ones are all well. Our thoughts and prayers are with everyone affected by this devastating wildfire and hurricane season. Today, USC Dornsife Professor Dr. Bill Devarell will be guiding us through a timely discussion on the increasingly hazardous nature of wildfires in the West. Part of this discussion will touch upon Indigenous fire management. We want to acknowledge that the USC Wrigley Institute and Wrigley Marine Science Center are located on the sacred and traditional grounds of the Tongva Nation. We honor the Tongva people, their contributions to society, and continued dedication to the stewardship of these lands, including Catalina Island. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions, and Dr. Deverell will address them at the end of the webinar. Please enter these questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens throughout the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, but your cameras are off, so please go ahead and relax. If you have any technical issues or need to leave for any reason, the recording will be emailed to you. We have a lot to cover, so I'll pass it over to the Wrigley Institute's Associate Director of Research and Engagement, Dr. Jessica Dutton, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you again to everybody for coming. I'm very happy to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Bill Devarell, to discuss his research on a topic that's unfortunately becoming increasingly relevant every year, that of wildfires in the American West. Dr. Deverell is a professor of history, spatial sciences, and environmental studies at USC Dornsife. He's also the director of the Huntington-USC Institute on California in the West, a doctoral training program for some of the nation's most talented scholars in Western American history. He's an American historian focusing on the 19th and 20th century American West with a BA in American Studies from Stanford and master's and Ph.D. degrees in history from Princeton. Dr. Deverell has a number of written works on political, social, ethnic, and environmental history. These include Whitewashed Adobe, The Rise of Los Angeles and the Remaking of its Mexican Past, and Railroad Crossing, Californians and the Railroad, 1850 to 1910. We're very fortunate to have Bill here today to talk about his current West on Fire project, investigating the past, present, and future of wildfire in the American West. And with that, I'll welcome him and turn it over to Bill.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Thanks to all my friends and colleagues at Wrigley for the invitation to speak to you all today. I'm delighted by being asked to join you all. I'm a new faculty affiliate with Wrigley, which is thrilling to me. And I'm here to talk about this project that is largely just underway. So I've kind of invited myself back in 3 years so we can display our findings. But I want to encourage you all out there to please feel entirely free, not only to pose questions during this webinar, but by all means keep in touch with us, with the project and myself, because we're always looking for imaginative ideas. We have room at the table for our research project, and we welcome anyone's input to this West on Fire initiative. So I grew up in Colorado. I grew up along the Front Range of Colorado, and in my boyhood there, through graduation from high school, I cannot remember a single large fire in the Front Range that sit right in front of the Big Rockies to the west of us, where I grew up. And yet, in that same neighborhood, over the course of the past decade, there have been 2 or perhaps even 3 very large fires that have burned the mountainscape near my boyhood home in an area that I had never seen burn. And of course, this is now increasingly common across the American West. And so as I thought about that, and several of these fires forced the evacuation of loved ones and family members, I began to think that the institute that I am privileged enough to work with and run for USC and the Huntington had better try to get our heads and arms around this issue of fire in the American West. And of course, recent events have proven that all the more urgent and emergent and tragic. And so this is a project like no other that my friends and colleagues and I have worked on in the sense that we usually work on fairly deep histories and the reverberations of those histories, but in examining fire in our contemporary society with historical roots, past and present and future come right up next to one another, and we feel like the work is tragically timely. So this project began with that recognition that I was seeing fires in the American West in ways that are places that I had not seen it before, or at a scale that I had not seen before. And I probably don't need to remind all of those of you out there that in the last decade, just in California alone, we've seen fires of a scale and magnitude that are just astonishing. So I think the tally is that the last decade we've seen 6 of the greatest fires in recorded history in California just in that decade alone. And the Creek Fire, which I may talk about towards the end of my remarks today, the Creek Fire is now the single largest single source fire in California history, still burning. So these are issues of incredible timeliness. There's so much information coming at us about fire and catastrophic fire that it's hard to sift it and try to know where an academic enterprise can begin to work around this. So the project that I'm to describe to you all is both, because it's brand new, it's, I think, exceedingly ambitious, but also I want to make it clear that we're going to have to make some choices about this very large topic as we move through it. But it's exciting to contemplate those choices. So the West on Fire initiative began through USC Dornsife. It began with a faculty-led workshop grant, basically, a precursor to a larger grant proposal that was submitted a year later. But the initial grant was essentially to draw together, based on our proposal, a number of disciplinary experts and members of the wider community to sit in essentially workshop capacity pre-COVID. So we actually were meeting with one another and draw on multiple disciplinary experts about issues of fire across the American West. The institute I run focuses largely on the 18th, 19th, and 20th century history and culture of the broad American West. So we knew we wanted to move beyond the boundaries of California. And certainly Western fire is spread out all across the region. And there are ways in which we can think about it well beyond California's boundaries, although California is a critical arena of all these fires. So that initial workshop grant, essentially coffee and cookies funding to draw together colleagues who we knew on our campus at USC, and also colleagues that we did not know who came to our attention through one avenue or another. Colleagues in the United States Forest Service, Indigenous fire practitioners. This project has a significant embrace of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous fire practice. Economists, writers, archivists, curators. We're deeply interested in the archival record of fire, and so we've always wanted to partner with our archivist and curatorial partners at this or that repository of historical and other kinds of knowledge. So the workshop met over the course of about 3 or 4 meetings, and from that, we drew together what became a larger grant proposal that went up through the chain of command at USC Dornsife, and we were very fortunate to receive the funding to launch the project in its bigger phase. It's a 3-year project, at least at this point. I'll speak about some other funding opportunities toward the end of my remarks. But right now it's a 3-year project that just began this term in earnest. We've had to work around the obvious pandemic challenges, but we think we're doing a pretty good job at that. And I know I can speak for my colleagues and members of the team. We're exceedingly excited about this work. We think there's a way to make a real contribution. I should add that given the ways in which the Institute on California in the West has always operated, this is a public-facing enterprise. This is scholarly expertise, but brought to as wide a public audience as we think we can reach, not least because we think the knowledge about fire in this era of climate change is absolutely critical to be spread far and wide. So I'll talk about some of the deliverables in that sense in a little bit. So the grant has been, obviously a bit of really good news to be able to support various pieces of this project. And I think what I'd like to do is talk about and invite your questions and comments about some of the facets that we know we want to put this project to work, thinking about Western fire. So I've made it clear, I think, that we're trying to think about the entirety of the American West, but in doing so, that's an impossible task given the regional scale of the American West. So we are going to break up the project into some case studies of various sites of Western fire across large sweeps of time. And we're going to produce those case studies in what amount to a kind of white paper exercise, which will be the summation report of this big project 3 to 3.5 years from now. A couple of really tangible research objectives. We had written into the grant the funding to bring in a research postdoc. The Institute on California in the West has a long and very exciting tradition, to my view, of working with young scholars just finishing their doctorates and learning from them because they're at the cutting edge of the field. And so we wrote in a research postdoc examining fire in any discipline across the American West. That postdoc search was supposed to have been launched a year from now, but given the Creek Fire in particular, as well as the recent Woolsey Fire and the Thomas Fire, we went to the administration at Dornsife and asked if we could accelerate that search and begin the search right now to bring in a young scholar as soon as the early summer of 2021 to be with us for a year and share her or his research findings on fire with the team. That request was granted, thankfully, because of the urgency of the issue. And we are currently searching for a research postdoc who will come and join us around what is becoming a fairly big table of multidisciplinary experts on fire. We're terribly excited about that prospect of bringing in a young scholar. It's entirely clear, given the applications we've already received, that the position has garnered attention from beyond the United States, as well as in the United States. And people who work on fire in the American West who happen not to be in the American West. And also our hope was the interdisciplinary reach and range of the applications would reveal multiple disciplines that work on fire, and sure enough, they have. So we've received applications obviously from historians who know about the Institute on California in the West, but earth scientists and others have applied for this job. So we'll make that choice probably sometime in the fairly new year, and then recruit that young person to come be with us remotely or otherwise, hopefully otherwise, as the project accelerates. I do want to talk a little bit about these case studies. We have decided on a couple of case studies to examine fire in our landscape across time. We haven't decided on all of them, nor have we really decided on how many there'll be. One we know we'll delve into for sure is Malibu. Many of you may be familiar with a fairly distinguished body of literature about fire and the ramifications and consequences of fire in Malibu, which we see over and over again on what amounts to a fairly regular basis over the past several decades. So we're going to write we've hired someone, environmental historian and ecologist, to work on a Malibu case study. He's actually a Malibu native, or he spent part of his life growing up in Malibu and remembers with great frequency the fires that burned down essentially Malibu Canyon Road over and over and over again. And so the Malibu case study is ideal for our interests, which is focused on the urban wildfire interface. We're not interested particularly in structural fires. We're interested in that interface, which is expanding, of course, across the American West as people and communities build perhaps where they should not build. Or maybe I should just take that perhaps out of there. So Malibu will occupy some central ground in a case study approach. And built into the Malibu case study, which we're going to more or less launch with the 1956 fires in Malibu and carry it forward onto the very recent past, and then prospectively look out across the future of Malibu and raise questions about private property and the defense of private property with public firefighting money, and risk mitigation and insurance and rebuilding of over and over again. And also, as our author of the Malibu case study reminds us, Malibu is very unusual because in many respects, the fuel source of the fires that continue to burn through Malibu with regular frequency are the houses themselves. Oftentimes wood shingles and wood frames, and we're going to raise real questions about that. So Malibu case study is, for our purposes, very, very important, and it allows our team to reach into the really local neighborhoods or local region and make some comments about history, the present, and the future. We have on our team a series of scientists, including our friend and colleague Josh West, who's affiliated with Wrigley, of course, an earth scientist, and Josh has helped our team with two significant features of our project. One is to remind historians that our timescales are not the timescales that perhaps earth scientists and geologists use, and that the timescales for fire across the American West stop at the 18th century. They go back well before human contact with this part of North America. And so Josh is helping us think about paleo fire, keeping an eye on deeper histories of fire through all kinds of scientific research and data regarding generally charcoal and the sediments that remain after large fires have burned through this or that landscape. So that's an important feature of what we're doing, and we'll probably have a case study of deep historical fire, probably across the entirety of the American West, to see what that can tell us about fire and fire regimes over time. Because like all scholars in a way, we're all looking for patterns and where patterns deviate and what we can learn from that. So Josh is helping us with that as well as others. And then equally important from our earth science colleagues is a reminder that fires are perhaps discrete events, but fires leave in their wake all kinds of other actions on the landscape and other consequences. So for instance, the Montecito debris flows, we're interested in that and the tragic consequences of that, as well as watershed issues in the aftermath of fires that burn up the undergrowth and burn up the hillsides that can't retain water. So when we balance that against climate change, and we see perhaps with real clarity the frequency of fires increasing, we also see the big swings in precipitation across the American West, much drier, but also much wetter. And we're interested in the consequences of that when fires come through. So Malibu, a deep historical case study. We are working in a close relationship with the chief historian of the U.S. Forest Service, who's headquartered in Fort Collins, which thankfully just got a lot of snow, which put out their very, very large fire along the Front Range, or just about got it. And with the help of the chief historian of the Forest Service, we're going to make contact with Forest Service personnel, add them to our team. We already have several colleagues from the Forest Service on the team, and we're going to think about, most likely, Rocky Mountain case study of fire. It might be that we go back to 1910. Many of you out there are probably familiar with the Big Burn of 1910, which burned up millions of acres of forest land in Idaho and Montana. And it's that moment, which is as critical as any other single moment in the ways in which the United States and its various public and private entities have fought fire or thought about fire from that moment forward. I'll get to that in a little minute, but we'll probably be addressing deep fire or fire in the Rocky Mountain landscape. As well, we're interested in the Northern Great Plains. And so working with some tree ring data members of our team, as well as others who study the pollen record and other kinds of carbon records of fires that burn through that landscape of the Northern Plains, we're likely to head up towards perhaps the Black Hills and look at a late 18th century fire, which burned across the entirety of certainly a summer, if not an entire year, and burned up millions of acres. So we may anchor a study of the Black Hills fires of the late 18th century as another case study. We have a significant interest in the project in enhancing the ways in which our students and students elsewhere, through the collaborations we've built with other faculty members at other institutions. It's part of the joy of this project is to meet other colleagues, both across campus as well as elsewhere. We have an obligation based on it used to be a hunch, but now I think it's been proven true, that not only do we have an obligation to teach our students about fire, and in our case, the fires of the American West, but we also find there's a real expressed interest in fire on the part of our students. And as unfortunately we dip into this new era of catastrophic fires, the student interest in curricular projects will only increase. So as part of that, our grant also underwrote the creation of new syllabi at the undergraduate and graduate level for interdisciplinary courses on fire. I'm pleased to say that we have 3 excellent syllabi from USC colleagues already: Peter Westwick, historian of science and technology; Alice Baumgartner, a Latin American and Western American specialist; and Mona Lisa Chatterjee, who studies environmental risk management at USC. The 3 of them have put together very interesting, slightly overlapping, but discrete and distinct syllabi. And we hope, of course, to see those move through the curricular acceptance processes at USC so that that new material and what we're learning from this project can go straight to our student populations. We have a significant social media presence through the Institute on California in the West. Our brief is essentially the history and culture of broad sweeps of the human past in the American West. And so we find that particularly here in the basin and the metropolis, there's a great hunger for outreach from academic knowledge to broad publics. And we meet that increasingly, as you all can understand, through social media platforms. So we have already begun to enhance our social media presence as a commentator on fire and the ways in which fire touches all our lives increasingly in the American West. And we'll continue to build that social media presence through this project. I should say that at the end of the day, 3 to 3.5 years from now, our every expectation is to hold a gigantic public conference on fire in the American West, probably called the West on Fire. The Institute has some real experience with big public conferences. They're always free. They're lively and interesting. They're not excessively pointy-headed, even though we rely on academic expertise. And we expect to put on a great big conference to invite the public to think through these issues with us about the West and fire. As part of that, we also expect to put out a book. These case studies that I've mentioned, Malibu, the Deep California Past, the Black Hills, these case studies are born to be made into chapters for a book, and we'll have other chapters as well that explore this conundrum of our time and region. We also, this is yet to be operationalized, of course, given the pandemic, but we also want to make sure we have the opportunity to take our team, as well as our curiosity, beyond the seminar space or beyond the archival or library repository and actually out into the field. So we are starting to work fairly closely with folks who we think can bring us into the field to try to understand fire in situ. And I'd like to talk about a little bit of that right now. We've built a partnership with a longtime friend and intellectual collaborator, a historical ecologist named Jared Aldern, who has become a lead investigator for our project or with our project. Jared has a career's worth of experience working not only in fire, but also working with Indigenous collaborators and Indigenous communities, largely in the Southern Sierra. One of the driving features of this project is to try to bring fire knowledge from every source to the center of the table and center of the dialogue. Indigenous fire practitioners, Indigenous fire knowledge is a deep and long-standing tradition, of course, in the Indigenous communities across the American West. So with Jared's help, also with the help of our colleague Teresa Greger from Cal State University Long Beach, we're building important ties to Indigenous communities, mostly in the Southern Sierra, but we expect to expand that as well. As part of that, we've just put in a grant request to the National Geographic Society. And if we're fortunate to be funded in that, we're going to build a big oral history component to this project. Oral histories will be taken in Malibu, around the Malibu case study. Oral histories will be taken in the Southern Sierra at one or more rancherias of Indigenous communities and tribal, sovereign tribal nations. And we also expect to do oral histories of undocumented migrant communities in Ventura and Santa Barbara region, folks who were burned out by the Woolsey Fire and the Thomas Fire. So we want to build a bank of oral histories because we expect that knowledge acquisition will be increasingly important with fire, and we think 60 to 100 original oral histories of very distinct communities will be helpful to us. The Indigenous piece of the puzzle is perhaps obvious in the sense that there's a great deal of knowledge there in Indigenous fire practice and fire memory and fire history and contemporary fire. So we are working with Indigenous partners with another grant that we're putting together with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy that we hope to go in, which would support 3 prescribed or what can be called cultural burns. Part of the challenge of fire in the American West, as everyone I think in this watching understands, is that we've lost a little bit of the, or perhaps a lot of the comfort with fire as a regular feature of our lives. And by militarizing our fight against fire, we're probably doing the wrong thing. And so Indigenous cultural practice of prescribed burns to mitigate the likelihood of catastrophic fires down the road is something we take very, very seriously. And there's a wealth of knowledge out there. And so if we're fortunate with this grant to the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, we'll work with private landowners and ranchers, Indigenous fire practitioners, and the Nature Conservancy, as well as a few other entities, to have in the fall of 2021, ideally, these 3 prescribed burns where our team can go either as observers, or if folks are willing to go through the training, which is pretty rigorous, as you can imagine, who may be able to participate in these. And we expect these as their own kind of case study of fire in the American West and new mechanisms by way of how to fight fire or how to fight catastrophic fire by actually trying to live with fire with a little bit more embrace than the ways in which we've been taught, largely again since 1910, to think about fire in our midst. I want to make sure that folks out there understand that we take on this project willing and absolutely required on our part to learn from a whole series of disciplinary takes on fire. The inputs into the catastrophic landscapes of fire in the American West are numerous, to say the least. Of course, climate change and drought are important actors in this. There's no question. I do think the militarized assault on fire that occupies the bulk of the 20th century is part of this. We have a relationship built with a USC graduate, a very, very talented creative nonfiction writer who's on the faculty at Louisiana State University, who came to us. We have a relationship with him through various projects we've worked on with him before, and he came to us and said, I hear you're working on fire. Is there any way in which a literary figure like myself could get involved? And admiring this man's talents as we do, we asked him to make us an argument or make us a proposal. And he said, well, I am a fellow New Mexican with Smokey the Bear. And I would like to write about Smokey the Bear and his cultural power across the 20th century in a way to orient people towards putting out fires at all costs. So we're probably going to take Josh up on that proposal and suggestion, and we'd like to hear what he has to say about Smokey the Bear. So the cultural input is an important one. We find largely through the insight of our colleague Peter Westwick, the historian of science and technology in the history department at SC, that CAL FIRE had the first and now certainly the most elaborate firefighting air force in American history. And so we want to take a look at some of those technological innovations of firefighting from the air. Crucial and critical, no doubt, and we see those planes. Just had them flying over my head just the other day, trying to fight probably the Santiago Canyon fire. But we want to have a facet there that tries to understand that as well. We also think that the insurance and risk and liability worlds have a great deal to do with our better understanding of the urban wildfire interface. What kinds of insurance and liability vehicles or products are under assault by ways in which catastrophic fire comes through? And how does that change building codes? And how does that change policy? We would be blind to an important facet of urban wildfire if we didn't pay attention to that as well. So building our team out with economists and folks who can help us understand that world through rich data analysis is an important feature of what we're up to. I mentioned the Indigenous fire practice, and what we might call Indigenous fire management is a key piece of this. There's no question. Let's see. I think I've fairly exhausted my outline. I understand this does sound so prospective, but we already have several features underway. As I mentioned, the young postdoc will join us soon. The syllabi are launched, and we'll be able to take those through curricular approval here fairly soon. These other grants are going forward to support the large and generous grant from USC Dornsife. We'd like the project to continue past the 3-year envelope of the USC Dornsife grant, and we'd like to amalgamate a lot of our findings into collection development and our archival partners. So we're partnered with USC Special Collections, we're partnered with the Huntington Library, we've built a partnership with the CAL FIRE archive out in San Bernardino County, and we want to be able to support those archives, to build on those archives, and create finding aids for scholars who show up at places like USC Special Collections and say, I'm here to study fire. So it's not that it's impenetrable, it's just that we can assist them by building greater tools of access because we know those scholars are going to come. And our aim is not only to support that scholarship at the highest level, but to take those findings into publicly accessible and publicly approachable venues, products, books, social media outreach, etc. Fire's not going away by any means, and so I think we need to turn our head to ways in which we can live with it far more comfortably than we find has happened in the very recent and in some ways not so recent past. So our aim is to try to change some perceptions, and we're finding other partner organizations and other research entities are tackling similar kinds of projects. So the opportunities for greater networking and collaboration are palpable. So I think I'll stop right there. I'm at my appointed time. I really appreciate your attention, and I'd be delighted to hear from you either through this vehicle or by all means, I'm easy to find in the history department at USC. Please feel entirely welcome and encouraged to reach out. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was a really great overview of the West on Fire initiative, and I can speak for all of us at Wrigley that we're really looking forward to hearing the stories and the work that comes out of it as it continues to grow. I'm now going to turn it over to Ann Close, Wrigley's Associate Director for Community Programs, who's going to moderate our Q&A.
All right. Well, Bill, thank you so much. That was incredibly eye-opening. And while people are gathering their thoughts for questions, I wanted to, first of all, say how happy we are to have you as part of the Wrigley Institute.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you.
It's, you know, you're talking about bringing together different disciplines in the community, and that's what we're all about. And so I'm very happy that we found each other. So
thank you, me too.
Yeah, just very excited about the future. So I actually have a question for you. So I'm gonna start this off. I'm really interested in Josh West's work and sort of how he looks at the records and, you know, finds out what the historical records have been. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, you know, how, I'm guessing he looks at the charcoal in the records and things, but can you just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I can do a little bit of it, and my expertise stops, you know, fairly quickly. But yeah, Josh is doing a great deal of field work with sediment and other kinds of core samples of various organic and inorganic materials. And he certainly understands the physics of debris flow in rather, what's the word I want? Well, very expert terms. And so when he talks to us about essentially with the debris flow work, getting to landscapes, either literally or figuratively, getting to landscapes after fires have burned, he can model what is either likely or just might happen should the precipitation follow too quickly on that. And also, one of the things I haven't really talked to Josh much about, but he would know this. I think it's fair to say that a great deal of the Western fires of late, because of their catastrophic qualities, they're burning hotter than we might traditionally expect. And apparently that heat differential is doing deep and lasting damage to the undergrowth, and particularly some of the seeds, which won't, sometimes seeds need fire smoke to germinate. We're finding that out as well. But sometimes the intensity of the fire's heat can destroy the germination possibilities of the seeds in the soil. And assuming that's true, and I think I have heard it on good authority that that is true, and we'll look at it, then that's only going to make the debris flow potentials all the more worse. And so we want to make sure we try to grapple with that as well. How you mitigate that, I guess, is probably more frequent, less hot fires. But how you get there, of course, is a problem of all kinds of dimensions.
Interesting, interesting. All right, we have a question. Will community planners be involved in your projects?
There's no reason they won't be. They're not yet because we haven't found them or gone looking for them. But for instance, with the Malibu case study, which is so neatly bounded by the jurisdictional or topographic boundaries of Malibu, we would be missing a great opportunity not to put community planners of that region into conversation with us because, well, A, they know more than we do, and B, we can learn from them. But then we want to be able to share what we're finding with them to see about making some real progress on addressing some of these issues. So certainly for a place like Malibu, I wouldn't see any reason why we couldn't work with those folks. And then, City of Los Angeles has sustainability officers and deputies. We'll probably find our way to them. We've just started looking at what I hope to be a partnership with the Nature Conservancy that knows a great deal about Western fire. And so we're just trying to build out the team as best we can. But yeah, the public aspect and the public agency of the agency side of this, absolutely critical.
Thank you. Stephen is curious to know if you have any comments on the consequences of the massive loss of topsoil that occurs in the first few rain events after fires.
Yeah, I mean, that's just part of this ways in which the fire is discrete, but not. So that's this great chain of trouble. And so I will acknowledge Stephen's point that I think it's absolutely correct. How you mitigate that, I'm sure there are people who are tasked with that in various regions or entities, tasked with trying to figure out how to mitigate that. But how you do it is very, very difficult, I think. By the way, I forgot to share a screen. I'll share, if it's okay, Anne. I'll just share a screen here, if people don't mind. Here is, this is a photograph taken by our colleague now and lead investigator, Jared Aldern, of what's called a pile burn, which is just what it looks like. It's thinning the landscape and then piling up what's been thinned and then carefully burning it, as opposed to a broadcast burn, which is burning a landscape, carefully controlled. And through Jared's insights, we're also learning about the ways in which Indigenous communities traditionally, and we hope increasingly, utilize their trail networks as fire breaks for prescribed burns. So wide, well-traveled trails make brilliant fire breaks. And so it's one way to approach a very, very clever and fairly simple, I guess, way to approach the use of prescribed burns.
Great, excellent. So Bill, you've amassed this amazing team, and that's fantastic and exciting, and I love all the people that are involved. Helen's curious to know about you specifically and what kind of research that you do.
Well, that's very nice. I'm an historian of the 19th and 20th century American West, and I've written about ethnic and environmental history. I wrote a book about the collision between the Mexican past and the Anglo future in Los Angeles. A friend of mine and I edited a collection of essays on the environmental history of Los Angeles. I've put out a series of anthologies with first-rate scholars on California and Western American history. And I've written about the 1920s, and I've written about a big, very, very ambitious landscape plan for Los Angeles, which was shattered on the shoals of political debate in the coming of the Great Depression. But had that been done, it was a plan made by the Olmsted brothers of Brookline, Massachusetts. Had that been done, we would live in a very different Los Angeles today.
Great. Let's see, Julie would like to know if there is evidence of the ancient North Americans starting frequent small fires to prevent huge fires, or did they only use fire to control their local environment, the local plants that are around them?
What a great question. I think the answer is out there. I think there probably is that the use of fire in the ways in which Julie suggests. We certainly know that at mission era contact, so post 16th, post 17th century, but latter 18th century contact with New Spain, the New Spain administrators, whether they were ecclesiastical or administrative, did not like Native American use of fire. And they clamped down on it in deleterious ways. And I think increasingly our knowledge of Native American burning practice will become a tried and true, better understanding of California history. So we're finding out more, and certainly the indigenous knowledge base is of prolonged and regular fire use. So we're just learning more. And by and large, this comes from just paying attention. I think many of the indigenous either folks that we're working with or people who've written or otherwise expressed their knowledge, they oftentimes say, well, you know, we've known this, you just haven't asked. Or if you asked, you didn't pay attention, or you know, cycles of conquest insisted that we not do this. And so that's a really fascinating dimension to this project.
So a little bit on the psychology side of this, which of course is an important part anytime you're dealing with the public. Do you have thoughts on the challenges of engaging homeowners in the efforts to prepare for wildfires?
Well, that's a great question. And you know, again, not to lean on our Malibu case study too hard, but we're gonna have to take that into account when we study the Malibu case studies, because it's not always true, but oftentimes people are rebuilding right where the fire took their house out. And so working with groups like Tree People, the Nature Conservancy, other environmental organizations that are trying to encourage people to utilize new practices about maybe even fire retardant building materials, or certainly landscapes that separate fuel sources from homes, and probably not such a good idea to make the home a fuel source. So we certainly have to pay attention to that very, very closely. And then the other cultural side is, somebody asked me the other day, and I do not know the answer to this, how come Smokey the Bear has gotten so buff in the 20th century? Smokey the Bear used to be a cub, and he was a cub. He was a bear cub rescued from a fire. But you see Smokey across the 20th century, and he's steroidal, with his arms crossed to say only you can prevent forest fires. So there's a cultural reflex here that is absolutely fascinating. So we're gonna try to figure that one out.
That is fascinating, going from that, you know, the bear being rescued to the powerful.
Yeah, so Smokey entered the consciousness as a vulnerable creature. But the Smokey we live with today is anything but vulnerable. So what that says about our approach to fire, our understanding of fire, it says a lot, I think, and we'd like to find out about it.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because you think about, you know, prescribed burns, and I think there's sometimes a fear of those. I think there's a general misunderstanding of just fire management in general.
I think that's right. Prescribed burns are not simple exercises. I know enough to say that. And sometimes things can go wrong, but by and large, I think the people who are the best at prescribed burns know exactly what they're doing. That's what we're finding out.
Great. Phillips has a question. Will you be examining impacts on wildlife and the factors that have helped them adapt or not to fire ecology?
Great question. It's too soon to know. I think right now our expertise in the non-human landscapes tend to be our earth science, geology, and tree ring data colleagues around the table. So we haven't yet begun to think about wildlife and wildlife effects or consequences of fire. But certainly there are people whose daily occupational lives are devoted to exactly that. And so I just hope they come to our attention, or we'll seek them out and we can absolutely make room for them at the table.
Great. We have a question. Is there emphasis on the different kinds of management solutions that are necessary across the state, or are your projects Chaparral specific?
Oh, great question. We are trying, because we're reaching out across the American West, and because we move from landscapes like Malibu up to the Southern Sierra and then across to the Great Plains, the vegetative makeup of those landscapes is incredibly variable, and the ignition and fuel sources thereof are also very variable. So a chaparral landscape is different than a conifer landscape, is different than a northern plains landscape. So we have, and which means fire is fire, but fire is not the same in every place by any stretch of the imagination. So we have to be cognizant of that variability.
Great. And a follow-up to that, do you work with the California Chaparral Institute?
We have not yet. Again, you know, we're just underway. I know those folks, I know of them, and I know they know a ton. And so if the questioner can put us in contact, I'd be very grateful, because we would love to have additional context in that way.
Fantastic. Let's see, can you talk a little bit more about how the case studies are carried out, how that process works?
Well, I can speak most directly to the Malibu one because it's the one that's furthest down the road, which means it's just been launched. So the scholar who's going to tackle that project, again, we're going to set the clock ticking largely at 1956 because of a big fire that, in a sense, kind of set the scar landscape for the next 70 years in Malibu. So Malibu and fire, Malibu and wealth, Malibu and celebrities. The celebrity landscapes of Malibu, which in the real celebritification of Malibu is a fairly recent phenomenon, to my understanding. That's an important feature of the attention paid to Malibu fires. And so we're going to get a hold of 75 years of fire in Malibu. Those fire scars will be mapped to show essentially the one on top of another quality of a lot of those fires in the same fire scars. And then we'll look at the rebuilding landscape, and we'll also look at the dimensions of public monies being used to protect private homes, which raises questions about should those homes either be made of what they're made of, or should they be there at all? And I'm not so sure our project will come up with an answer for all these questions, but we sure want to pose them. So self-contained, historically fairly discrete project that will become a conference paper, an essay and an anthology, and hopefully a whole series of social media outreach posts.
Great. We've got another great question from Stephen. He's curious to know if you have soil microbial ecologists on your team.
Not yet. Not yet. Yeah. You know, it's very exciting to sit here at the beginning of a project and get these inputs from learned people out there. I have no reason at this point to rule out any expertise. At some point, we'll have to make hard decisions. But you know, fire is an actor that is, by definition, multidisciplinary, 360 degrees of disciplinary intakes. So to do it justice, we have to be as small c Catholic as we can in terms of taking in expertise.
Will you be observing how national policies trickle down or impact the state and local level?
Yes. We know a little bit about this, and others out there know more than we do. So for instance, one of the things we're interested in, we took a trip last year, parts of our team, and went to northern Wyoming and met in Grand Teton National Park for a kind of workshop. And the Forest Service historian joined us to help us start to think through the very earliest stages of this project. And one thing's fairly clear is that, for instance, the National Park Service and the United States Forest Service have more or less different fire ideologies or different firefighting perceptions. They're not completely binary, but they're different. And so addressing, and given, you know, you add the Bureau of Land Management into that equation, you're covering millions and millions of acres of the American West. So we would have to, given our brief here of the West, we would have to try to understand the firefighting approach, or the fire approach, or the fire thinking of entities like Park Service, Forest Service, BLM. So yes, that'll be part of what we're up to.
Great. And you know, you mentioned there's all this wonderful space for people to get involved. I know we have undergraduates in on this call. Can you say a few words to the undergrads on here about how they might be able to interact with you?
Yes. Undergrads, there are all these, not tons of them, but there's these vehicles for research support, particularly across the summers, SURF and SOAR and other kinds of programs. I would urge any undergraduate who's interested in this to make contact with me, and we can investigate the possibility of an approach to one of these funding sources on the campus to support independent research. The project advised a Caltech student this summer, a young woman named Madeline Swint, who did a wonderful job studying LA basin fires since the big 1933 Griffith Park fire, which killed a great many amateur firefighters who got caught in a canyon and couldn't react. So undergraduate research is a possibility. And then if the students out there on this call are underclass, freshmen, sophomores, keep your eyes open, because by the time you're juniors and seniors, I expect these courses that we've sponsored, these new syllabi, will be offered. And it'd be great to have you in there.
Oh, that's exciting. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and take our last question here from Rex, who says, having gone through the Woolsey fire, and successfully saved my home, and having fire department literature that says not to leave sprinklers on if you leave your property, unlike prior fires, firefighters today endeavor to save lives, not so much property. I know I had water pressure the entire time. What are your thoughts? If firefighters are not around, should owners evacuate, leaving roof sprinklers on, and should the directive be changed and not leave on? Do you have some advice?
Excellent question, and well beyond my knowledge. I have to admit, I don't know the answer to that. I'll keep it in the back of my head because I suspect it'll come up again, given if there's this real change in practice or advice. Excellent question, but I just don't know the answer. I apologize.
That's great. That's again, Bill, thank you so much. I'll speak on behalf of the whole Wrigley Institute that we are just couldn't be more pleased and can't wait to continue this work with you in whatever way we can help.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thanks to everybody. I really enjoyed it.
You bet. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Katie Shevostel.
Right, yes, thank you, Bill, for such an informative presentation, and thanks to all of you out there for your thoughtful questions and participation. To tackle environmental issues such as natural hazards, it is essential not only to understand their impacts, but societal practices and where we've been. If any of you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out. I'll be sending out an email with contact information and a link to the webinar recording. If you'd like to check out any of our previous webinars, the series is hosted on our Meet the Wrigley Faculty YouTube playlist. You can find this URL in the chat box. We'll be taking a brief pause over the holidays and resume the webinar series in the new year. Again, thank you for joining us today. We're so grateful for your participation. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you next year.